When Sarah announced she was pregnant, I should have felt joy. Instead, I felt a cold dread wash over me that I couldn't explain. She had just returned from a 3-week business conference in Denver, and as she stood in our kitchen holding that positive pregnancy test, something deep in my gut screamed that this moment would destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. My name is Marcus, and I'm about to tell you how a single business trip unraveled 15 years of marriage and revealed truths that would shatter any man's world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah and I met in college at the University of Portland. She was studying marketing, I was pursuing engineering, and we fell in love over late-night study sessions at the campus coffee shop. She had this infectious laugh that could fill an entire room, and when she smiled, her green eyes would crinkle at the corners in a way that made my heart skip. We were inseparable from our junior year onward, planning our future together like two kids drawing blueprints for a dream house. After graduation, we moved to Seattle where I landed a job at a tech startup and Sarah joined a growing advertising firm. Those early years were magical. We lived in a tiny one-bedroom apartment with a leaky faucet and a radiator that clanged all night, but we didn't care. We'd cook pasta dinners on our ancient stove and dance around the cramped living room to music streaming from my laptop speakers. Sarah would wear my oversized college sweatshirt and nothing else, spinning barefoot on the hardwood floor while I tried to keep up with her rhythm. We married on a rainy October afternoon in 2009. Sarah looked radiant in her grandmother's vintage wedding dress, the lace sleeves perfectly framing her delicate shoulders. The ceremony was small, just our families and closest friends gathered in the old chapel where her parents had met 30 years earlier. My best man Jake stood beside me, grinning as Sarah walked down the aisle to the sound of acoustic guitar. When the minister asked us to exchange vows, Sarah's voice trembled with emotion as she promised to love me through whatever storms life might bring. I meant every word when I promised the same. Our first home was a modest 2-story colonial in a quiet neighborhood called Maple Heights, about 20 minutes from downtown. The house needed work, but we threw ourselves into renovation projects every weekend. Sarah had an eye for design that amazed me. She could walk into a room and instantly envision how to transform it, seeing potential where I only saw problems. She painted our bedroom a soft lavender and hung vintage photographs she'd collected from antique shops. The kitchen became her domain, filled with herbs growing on the windowsill and copper pots hanging from a rack I'd installed above the island. For years we tried to have children. Month after month we hoped and waited, enduring the crushing disappointment when Sarah's period would arrive right on schedule. We went through fertility testing, tried different medications, tracked ovulation cycles with scientific precision. The doctors couldn't find anything definitively wrong with either of us, which somehow made it worse. There's a special kind of heartbreak that comes with unexplained infertility, a sense that your body is betraying you in ways you can't understand or control. Sarah took each negative pregnancy test harder than I did. I'd find her crying in the bathroom, staring at another single pink line, and I'd hold her until her sobs subsided. She'd apologize through her tears, as if failing to get pregnant was somehow her fault alone. Those were the moments when I loved her most fiercely, when her vulnerability made me want to protect her from every disappointment the world could offer. After 5 years of trying, we'd nearly given up hope. Sarah threw herself into her career with renewed focus, earning promotion after promotion at the marketing firm. She developed a reputation for creative campaigns that doubled client engagement rates. Her confidence grew as her professional success mounted, and I was proud to watch her flourish even as our personal dreams remained elusive. The pregnancy announcement came on a Tuesday evening in March. Sarah had been acting strange for a week, declining her usual glass of wine with dinner and complaining of nausea she attributed to a stomach bug. When she emerged from the bathroom holding that test, her face was a mixture of shock and pure elation. She ran to me, practically tackling me on the couch, repeating, "We're having a baby," over and over like a mantra of disbelief. I should have been overjoyed. After years of disappointment, this was the miracle we'd prayed for. But as Sarah babbled excitedly about due dates and nursery colors, a nagging voice in the back of my mind kept whispering questions I didn't want to acknowledge. The timing felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. She'd just returned from that extended business trip to Denver, her longest time away from home in our entire marriage. Denver, the word started haunting me in quiet moments. Sarah had been attending a national marketing conference, something her company had sent her to present their latest campaign strategies. She'd called me every night for the first week, chattering about networking events and industry workshops. But during the second week, the calls became shorter and less frequent. When I'd ask about her day, her answers grew vague and distracted. The third week, she barely called at all. When I'd reach out to her, she'd claim she was exhausted from long conference days and just wanted to sleep. Her explanations made sense on the surface, but something in her tone felt different. Distant, like she was speaking to me from across a canyon I couldn't see. Now holding her as she celebrated our long-awaited pregnancy, those Denver memories took on a sinister new meaning. The timing was impossible to ignore. She'd been gone for 3 weeks and now she was pregnant. The math was simple, brutal, and undeniable. If this baby was conceived during her trip, then everything I thought I knew about my marriage was built on lies. But I pushed those thoughts away, guilt-ridden for even having them. This was Sarah, my wife of 15 years, the woman who'd stood beside me through every challenge we'd faced. She'd never given me reason to doubt her faithfulness, never so much as glanced at another man when we were out together. These suspicious thoughts were my own insecurity talking, the paranoid whispers of a mind trying to sabotage the happiness we'd waited so long to experience. Sarah scheduled her first prenatal appointment for the following week. She bounced around the house like a teenager, researching baby names and bookmarked shopping websites for nursery furniture. She bought pregnancy books and started taking prenatal vitamins with the dedication of someone making up for lost time. Her excitement was infectious, and I found myself getting swept up in visions of our future family despite the nagging doubts that wouldn't completely disappear. The night before her doctor's appointment, Sarah curled up against me in bed, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. She talked dreamily about whether the baby would have my dark hair or her blonde waves, whether it would inherit her artistic eye or my analytical mind. She painted pictures of family vacations and Christmas mornings, bedtime stories and soccer games. Her happiness was radiant and complete, and I felt like a monster for the dark thoughts lurking in the corners of my consciousness. Martinez confirmed the pregnancy and estimated Sarah was about 6 weeks along. The timing placed conception right in the middle of her Denver trip. As we drove home from the appointment, Sarah chattered excitedly about scheduling the ultrasound and when we should start telling people our news. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and tried to focus on her joy instead of the calendar calculations spinning through my head. That evening I found myself staring at Sarah's phone while she showered. It sat on the dresser, screen dark and innocent, holding secrets I both desperately wanted and dreaded to discover. I'd never snooped through her personal things in our entire relationship. Trust had been the foundation of everything we'd built together. But the questions were eating me alive from the inside, and I could feel my sanity starting to fray at the edges. I picked up her phone with shaking hands. The lock screen showed a photo of us from our anniversary dinner 2 months earlier, both of us smiling and oblivious to the storm that was coming. I knew her passcode, had known it for years because we'd never hidden anything from each other. At least I thought we hadn't. The phone unlocked to reveal her text message history. Most of the recent conversations were mundane exchanges with coworkers, her sister or neighbor about picking up packages. But there near the bottom of the list, was a conversation thread with a name I didn't recognize, David Chen. The last message was from 3 days after she'd returned from Denver. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened the conversation. What I found there would haunt me for the rest of my life. Messages that started professional and gradually became intimate. Inside jokes and shared memories from their time at the conference. Late-night conversations that grew increasingly personal and flirtatious, and then, buried in the middle of the thread, messages that left no doubt about what had happened in Denver. I can't stop thinking about last night, David had written. Sarah's response made my stomach lurch. I know we said it was just the conference, but I've never felt anything like that before. The messages continued, each one driving the knife of betrayal deeper into my chest. They'd spent 3 nights together during the second week of her trip. 3 nights while I'd been home alone, worried about her silence and missing my wife. The final messages were from just before she'd flown home. I wish this didn't have to end, David wrote. Sarah's reply was worse than anything that had come before. Me too, but I have a life to get back to, a husband who doesn't deserve this.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The casual way she dismissed our marriage, reducing me to an inconvenient obstacle to her happiness, cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever experienced. I set her phone down with trembling hands and sank onto the edge of our bed. The shower was still running in the bathroom, Sarah humming softly to herself, completely unaware that her world was about to collapse. In the span of 10 minutes, every assumption I'd made about my life had been destroyed. My wife had cheated on me during her business trip. She was pregnant with another man's child, and she expected me to raise this baby as my own, living a lie for the rest of my life. The bathroom door opened and Sarah emerged wrapped in a towel, her hair damp and her cheeks flushed from the hot water. She looked at me sitting on the bed and her expression immediately shifted to concern. "Marcus, honey, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I stared at her, this woman I'd loved for half my adult life, and struggled to find words. How do you confront someone about betrayal so complete it redefines your entire reality? How do you ask your pregnant wife if the baby she's carrying belongs to another man? The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. I found the messages. I finally whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. The ones from David Chen. Sarah's face went white, the towel slipped slightly in her grasp, and for a moment she looked like she might faint. Then her expression hardened, cycling through denial, anger, and finally resignation in the span of seconds. She sat down heavily on the bed beside me, still clutching her towel, no longer bothering to maintain the pretense of innocence. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. "About 15 minutes, I replied, long enough to feel my entire life fall apart. Sarah closed her eyes and took a shuddering breath. When she opened them again, they were filled with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of regret or just self-pity at being caught. She reached toward me, but I pulled away before she could touch me. The thought of her hands on me, hands that had touched another man while she was supposed to be my faithful wife, made my skin crawl. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "David and I worked together on a campaign presentation. We spent a lot of time preparing, rehearsing. He was brilliant and funny, and I felt connected to him in a way I hadn't felt in years, but I never intended for it to become physical." Her words were like acid poured into an open wound. She was describing falling for another man, having an emotional affair that became physical, all while I'd been home alone thinking about how much I missed her. She was explaining betrayal as if it were something that had simply happened to her rather than a series of choices she'd made. "The baby," I said, my voice hollow, "is it his?" Sarah's silence was answer enough. She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I think so, the timing matches. But Marcus, I want you to know that I came home to you. I chose our marriage. I chose our life together. This pregnancy, it's a gift we can accept together. You've always wanted to be a father, and this could be your chance." The audacity of her words left me speechless. She was asking me to raise another man's child while pretending it was mine. She was asking me to build our family on a foundation of lies and betrayal. She was asking me to sacrifice my dignity, my self-respect, and my right to the truth, all so she could avoid the consequences of her choices. "You want me to pretend this baby is mine?" I asked, my voice growing stronger with anger. "You want me to lie to everyone we know, to lie to the child, to live a lie for the next 18 years? It doesn't have to be a lie," Sarah insisted, reaching for me again. "Biology isn't everything. You would be the father in every way that matters. You'd love this baby, raise this baby, be there for every milestone. David will never know. He lives in Chicago, and he thinks I'm happily married. This can be our secret, our family." I stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, our neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. Kids playing in yards, neighbors walking dogs, the normal rhythm of suburban life continuing, while my world burned down around me. Nothing had changed out there, but everything had changed in here. The life Sarah was describing sounded like a prison sentence, a lifetime of knowing that my marriage was built on betrayal, and my fatherhood on deception. "What about David?" I asked. "Doesn't he deserve to know he has a child?" Sarah's face hardened. "David doesn't want children. He told me that explicitly. He's focused on his career, traveling constantly for work. He would see this baby as a complication, not a blessing, but you've always wanted to be a father. This could be perfect for everyone." Perfect. She was calling this nightmare scenario perfect. I realized in that moment that the woman I'd married, the woman I'd loved for 15 years, was either delusional or more selfish than I'd ever imagined possible. She was willing to build our future family on a foundation of lies because it was convenient for her. She was willing to deny a man knowledge of his biological child and ask me to live a lifetime of deception because it fit her narrative of having everything she wanted. I need time to think, I said finally. I can't process this right now. I can't even look at you right now. Marcus, please, Sarah begged, standing up and moving toward me. We can work through this. Couples overcome infidelity all the time. This baby doesn't have to be a problem. It can be a solution. The family we've always wanted. I held up a hand to stop her approach. Don't, just don't. You cheated on me during a business trip. You're pregnant with another man's child, and your solution is for me to pretend none of this happened and raise his baby as mine. Do you hear how insane that sounds? Sarah's tears started flowing harder. It's not insane. It's love. It's choosing our marriage over a mistake. It's choosing to build something beautiful from something broken. But I couldn't see beauty in her proposal. All I could see was deception stretching endlessly into the future. Every diaper change would be a reminder of her betrayal. Every birthday party would be a celebration of lies. Every moment of pride in my child's achievements would be tainted by the knowledge that I was living someone else's life. I grabbed my keys from the dresser and headed for the bedroom door. I'm going to stay at Jake's tonight. I need space to figure out what comes next. Marcus, wait, Sarah called after me, but I was already down the stairs and heading for the garage. I couldn't spend another minute in that house, surrounded by the remnants of a life that had been revealed as fiction. I needed distance, perspective, and time to decide whether my marriage was something that could be saved or something that needed to be buried. As I backed out of our driveway, I caught a glimpse of Sarah standing at our bedroom window, still wrapped in her towel, watching me leave. Part of me wanted to turn around, to hold her and pretend that love could somehow overcome this betrayal, but a larger part of me knew that some lines once crossed can never be uncrossed. Some betrayals are too complete to forgive, too devastating to forget. The drive to Jake's house gave me time to think, but thinking only made everything worse. Every happy memory from our marriage now felt contaminated. Had Sarah been thinking about other men during our anniversary dinner? Had she been comparing me to potential lovers when we'd made love? Had our entire relationship been a compromise for her, something she'd settled for while secretly longing for more excitement? Jake lived across town in a bachelor pad that hadn't changed much since college. When he opened the door and saw my face, he immediately stepped aside to let me in. Jake had been my roommate senior year, my best man at the wedding, and the kind of friend who asked questions later and offered support first. He took one look at me and went straight to his liquor cabinet. "What happened?" he asked, handing me a glass of whiskey. I told him everything. The business trip, the pregnancy announcement, the text messages, Sarah's proposal that I raise another man's child. Jake listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When I finished, he sat back in his recliner and shook his head. "Jesus, Marcus, I don't even know what to say. That's not just cheating, that's a whole different level of betrayal. She wants me to pretend it's mine," I said, taking a large swallow of whiskey. "She thinks I should be grateful for the opportunity to finally be a father, even if the child isn't biologically mine." Jake snorted in disgust. "That's the most selfish thing I've ever heard. She cheats on you, gets pregnant, and then asks you to cover for her mistake. And she's framing it like she's doing you a favor." Hearing someone else articulate the insanity of Sarah's proposal made it crystal clear. This wasn't about love or forgiveness, or building something beautiful from something broken. This was about Sarah wanting to have her cake and eat it too. She wanted the excitement of an affair and the security of a marriage. She wanted to experience passion with David and stability with me, and she wanted me to be grateful for the opportunity to live a lie. "What are you going to do?" Jake asked. "I have no idea," I admitted. "Part of me wants to pack my things and never see her again. But we've been together for 15 years. That has to count for something, doesn't it?" Jake leaned forward, his expression serious. "Marcus, those 15 years aren't erased by what happened in Denver, but they don't obligate you to accept this either. You have to decide what you can live with and what you can't. Can you really spend the next 18 years looking at that kid and knowing it's not yours?" Can you stay married to someone who thinks lying to you for the rest of your life is an acceptable solution to her infidelity? His questions hit home because they were the same ones circling through my mind. I'd always imagined that if Sarah ever cheated on me, the decision about what to do next would be clear-cut. I'd assumed I'd either forgive her completely or leave immediately. But the reality was far more complicated. This wasn't just about infidelity. It was about paternity, about building a family on deception, about living a fundamental lie for the rest of my life. I spent 3 days at Jake's house, ignoring Sarah's calls and texts. She left voicemails alternating between apologies and pleas, sometimes within minutes of each other. She promised to cut all contact with David, to attend counseling, to do whatever it took to rebuild our marriage. But she never wavered from her central premise that I should accept this pregnancy and raise the child as my own. On the 4th day I finally went home. Sarah was waiting for me in the kitchen, looking haggard and exhausted. She'd clearly been crying, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. She stood up when I walked in, hope and fear warring on her face. "I've been thinking," I said without preamble, "about what you're asking me to do. And," she whispered, "I can't do it, Sarah. I can't spend the rest of my life pretending this baby is mine when I know it isn't. I can't lie to our families, our friends, the child. I can't build our future on that kind of deception." Sarah's face crumpled. "So what does that mean? Are you leaving me?" "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "But I know I can't do what you're asking. If we're going to have any chance of working through this, it has to be based on truth, not lies. David has a right to know he has a child. The baby has a right to know who their biological father is, and I have a right to make my own choices about fatherhood, not have it forced on me through deception." Sarah shook her head violently. "You don't understand. David won't want this baby. It will complicate everything. It will destroy what we're trying to rebuild." "What we're trying to rebuild is already destroyed," I said quietly. "You destroyed it the moment you decided to have an affair. Now we have to figure out if there's anything worth salvaging from the wreckage." The conversation that followed was the most difficult of our marriage. Sarah alternated between rage and desperation, sometimes within the same sentence. She accused me of being rigid and unforgiving. She claimed I was more concerned with my pride than with our family's future. She insisted that biology didn't matter, and that love was the only thing that made someone a parent. Some of her arguments had merit. Adopted children weren't loved any less by their parents. Stepfathers could be wonderful fathers. Biology wasn't everything when it came to family bonds. But all of those situations were built on honesty and choice. They were based on people making informed decisions about the families they wanted to build. What Sarah was proposing was built on lies and coercion. "I need to know something," I said during a brief pause in our argument. "When you were with David, did you think about me at all? Did you consider what this would do to our marriage?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she finally answered, her voice was barely audible. "I tried not to think about you. When I was with him, I wanted to pretend that my life here didn't exist. It felt like I was someone else, someone free to make different choices." Her honesty was brutal but necessary. She had compartmentalized her affair, treating it like a separate existence where consequences didn't apply. She had chosen to betray our marriage not in a moment of weakness, but through a deliberate decision to temporarily abandon the commitment she'd made to me. "And now you want me to help you maintain that compartmentalization," I said. "You want me to pretend your affair never happened by raising the child it produced." "I want us to move forward," Sarah insisted. "I want us to build a family together regardless of how this pregnancy started. But moving forward and moving past something are two very different things. Moving forward requires acknowledging what happened and dealing with the consequences honestly." What Sarah wanted was to move past the inconvenient parts of her affair while keeping the parts that benefited her. That night, lying in our guest bedroom because I couldn't bear to share a bed with her, I made my decision. I would stay and try to work on our marriage, but only under certain conditions. David had to be told about the pregnancy. The baby's true parentage would not be hidden from our families or from the child when they were old enough to understand. And Sarah had to enter individual counseling to understand why she'd made the choices that led to this betrayal. When I presented these conditions to Sarah the next morning, she reacted as if I was asking her to set herself on fire. "You're trying to humiliate me," she accused. "You want everyone to know what I did so they'll think less of me." "I want everyone to know the truth," I corrected. "The same truth I had to discover by reading your text messages." The same truth you were prepared to hide from me for the rest of our lives. Sarah paced around the kitchen, her hands gesturing wildly. David doesn't need to know about this baby. It will only complicate his life for no reason. It's his child, Sarah. He has fundamental rights here that you can't just decide to ignore. What if he wants custody? What if he wants to be involved? What if he tries to take the baby away from us? These were legitimate fears, but they didn't justify lying to him. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But he deserves to know he has a child, and the baby deserves to know their biological father. You don't get to make that decision for everyone involved. The argument continued for hours, with Sarah growing increasingly desperate as she realized I wouldn't budge on my conditions. She offered compromises. Maybe we could tell David after the baby was born. Maybe we could tell our families it was the result of fertility treatments. Maybe we could move to a different city where no one would know the truth. Each compromise was still built on deception, still required me to live a lie. I realized that Sarah fundamentally couldn't understand why the truth mattered so much to me. To her, the truth was just one option among many, something to be managed and manipulated to produce the most convenient outcome. But to me, the truth was the foundation that any real reconciliation would have to be built on. If you can't accept my conditions, I told her finally, then we don't have a marriage to save. I won't live a life built on lies, no matter how comfortable or convenient those lies might be. Sarah stared at me for a long moment, tears streaming down her cheeks. Then she nodded slowly, the fight going out of her. Okay, she whispered, I'll call David today. But even as she agreed, I could see in her eyes that she was hoping I'd change my mind, that time would soften my resolve, and eventually I'd see things her way. She was agreeing to my conditions because they were the only way to keep me, not because she truly understood why they were necessary. That afternoon, Sarah sat at our kitchen table with her phone in her hand, staring at David's number for nearly an hour before making the call. I gave her privacy for the conversation, but I could hear the cadence of her voice through the closed door. The call lasted almost 2 hours, with long stretches of silence punctuated by bursts of intense conversation. When she finally emerged from the kitchen, her face was pale and streaked with tears. He's coming to Seattle next weekend, she said quietly. He wants to meet with both of us to discuss what comes next. How did he take the news? I asked. He was shocked at first, then angry that I waited so long to tell him, but he says he wants to be involved, to help support the baby financially and emotionally. Sarah's voice was hollow, defeated. He's already talking about custody arrangements and visitation schedules. This was exactly what Sarah had feared, but it was also exactly what I'd expected. David was a decent man who, faced with the knowledge that he was going to be a father, wanted to step up and take responsibility. This was going to complicate our lives in ways we couldn't yet imagine, but it was the right thing to do. The week before David's visit passed slowly. Sarah grew more withdrawn each day, the reality of what we were facing settling over her like a weight. She was going to have to face the man she'd had an affair with, while sitting next to the husband she'd betrayed. She was going to have to navigate conversations about custody and child support, and co-parenting with two men who had very different relationships with her and with this pregnancy. Meanwhile, I struggled with my own emotions about the upcoming meeting. Part of me was curious about David, wondering what kind of man had captured my wife's attention so completely that she'd risked our marriage for him. Another part of me dreaded seeing them together, worried about what their dynamic would reveal about my own inadequacies as a husband. But mostly I was terrified about what this meeting would mean for our future. Once David was officially part of this situation, there would be no going back to the way things were. Our marriage would become a complicated triangle involving another man who had intimate knowledge of my wife and legal rights to the child she was carrying. The simple life we'd built together was about to become anything but simple. The night before David's arrival, Sarah and I lay in bed together for the first time since I'd discovered her affair. We didn't touch, didn't talk, just shared the same space while lost in our own thoughts about what tomorrow might bring. In the darkness, I wondered if this was what the end of a marriage felt like. Two people lying side by side, further apart than they'd ever been, preparing to face a future that neither of them had chosen but both would have to navigate. Whatever happens tomorrow, Sarah whispered into the darkness, I want you to know that I love you. I've always loved you, even when I made terrible choices that suggested otherwise. I wanted to tell her I loved her too, but the words stuck in my throat. Love hadn't been enough to prevent her affair, wouldn't be enough to erase the consequences of her choices, and it might not be enough to save our marriage from the complicated reality we were about to face. Sometimes love simply isn't enough to overcome the weight of betrayal and the complex demand. Tomorrow would bring David to our door, and with him a future none of us could predict. The simple story of Marcus and Sarah would become the complicated story of Marcus, Sarah, David, and a baby who would grow up knowing that love, family, and truth were far more complex than most people ever imagined. David Chen arrived at our house on a Saturday morning that felt heavy with unspoken dread. Through the living room window, I watched him park his rental car in our driveway and sit there for several minutes, collecting himself before this awkward confrontation. He was shorter than I'd imagined, with neat black hair and wide-rimmed glasses that gave him an intellectual appearance. He wore a pressed button-down shirt and dark, careful casual attire of someone trying to make a good impression in an impossible situation. Sarah answered the door when he knocked, and the moment I saw them together, something twisted in my gut. There was a familiarity between them that went beyond their brief affair, a comfort level that suggested deeper intimacy than just physical attraction. The way her posture shifted when she saw him, the unconscious step she took closer to him before catching herself, told me more about their connection than hours of explanation could have conveyed. "David, thank you for coming," Sarah said formally, though her voice carried undertones I recognized from our early dating years. "Please come in, this is my husband Marcus." David extended his hand toward me, with the awkward politeness of someone meeting his lover's betrayed husband. His handshake was firm, his eye contact direct, and I found myself studying his face for signs of guilt or remorse. What I saw instead was determination mixed with obvious discomfort. This wasn't easy for him either, but he was here because he felt obligated to face the consequences of his actions. We settled in our living room, the same space where Sarah and I had hosted countless dinner parties and holiday gatherings over the years. Now it felt like a courtroom, where we were about to negotiate the future of a child who didn't yet exist in any meaningful way beyond a positive pregnancy test. Sarah sat on one end. Sat on one end of the couch, I sat on the other, and David chose the armchair across from us, creating a triangle of tension that seemed to fill the entire. "I want to start by apologizing," David said, directing his words toward me. "What happened between Sarah and me was inexcusable. I knew she was married, and I pursued the relationship anyway. I take full responsibility for my part in this situation." His directness surprised me. I'd expected excuses or attempts to minimize what had happened. Instead, David acknowledged the reality of their affair without trying to soften it with explanations about conference stress, or alcohol, or temporary insanity. He owned what he'd done, which was more than Sarah had managed in all our conversations since I'd discovered the truth. "Thank you for that," I replied, though forgiveness felt impossible at that moment. "Sarah tells me you want to be involved with the baby." "I do," David said firmly. "I never expected to become a father, certainly not under these circumstances, but now that I know about the pregnancy, I can't pretend it's not my responsibility. This child will be part of me, and I want to be part of their life in whatever way makes sense for everyone involved." Sarah shifted uncomfortably beside me. This was the scenario she'd dreaded, the complication she'd hoped to avoid by hiding the truth from David. She'd wanted to control the narrative, to manage the consequences of her affair in ways that protected her vision of our future family. But David's presence here, his claims on the baby she was carrying, shattered any illusion of control she might have maintained. "What exactly does that mean to you?" I asked. "Being part of the child's life?" David leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "I've spent the past week researching custody laws and co-parenting arrangements. I know this situation is unusual, but there are legal precedents for fathers maintaining relationships with children whose mothers are married to other men. I want visitation rights, input into major decisions about the child's upbringing, and the opportunity to develop a real relationship with my son or daughter." The clinical way he discussed custody and visitation made my stomach clench. This was my wife's pregnancy we were talking about, the baby I'd thought might finally make us a family. But David's legal rights were undeniable. He was the biological father, and he had claims that superseded my emotional attachment to the idea of raising this child. "What about financial support?" Sarah asked quietly, speaking for the first time since the introductions. "I'll pay child support, of course," David replied. "Whatever the court determines is appropriate based on my income and the child's needs. But I also want to contribute in other ways. I want to be at doctor's appointments, help choose a pediatrician, be involved in decisions about childcare and education." Sarah's face grew paler with each item on David's list. She was realizing that accepting his financial support meant accepting his involvement in every aspect of our child's life. There would be no compartmentalizing this time, no pretending that her affair was a separate chapter that could be closed and forgotten. David's presence would be a constant reminder of her betrayal and the complicated family structure we were about to create. "I think we need to establish some boundaries," I said, finding my voice. "If you're going to be involved, we need clear agreements about how this will work. I'm not comfortable with you having unlimited access to our home or our lives." David nodded understandingly. "I don't want to intrude on your marriage or make this more difficult than it already is. I'm thinking more about scheduled visits, maybe alternating weekends or specific days during the week. We could meet at neutral locations if that's more comfortable for everyone." The practicalities of co-parenting with my wife's former lover were staggering. We were talking about dividing up a child's time between 3 adults who had fundamentally different relationships with each other and completely different visions for how this arrangement should work. Sarah wanted David to disappear. I wanted honesty and clear boundaries. David wanted meaningful involvement in his biological child's life. "There's something else we need to discuss," David said, his tone growing more serious. "My parents, they're going to want to be involved as well. This will be their first grandchild, and they'll expect access to the baby." Sarah made a small sound of distress. She hadn't considered the extended implications of David's involvement, the fact that his family would also have legitimate claims on the child she was carrying. Our baby would have 2 sets of grandparents, 2 family trees, 2 complete support systems that might not always agree about what was best for the child's future. "How do you plan to explain this situation to your parents?" I asked. David was quiet for a moment, obviously having wrestled with this question already. "I'm going to tell them the truth, that I had a relationship with a married woman during a business conference, and she became pregnant as a result. They won't approve of my behavior, but they'll support me in taking responsibility for the consequences." His commitment to honesty was both admirable and terrifying. While Sarah and I were still negotiating about how much truth to reveal and to whom, David was prepared to face his family's judgment head-on. He wasn't trying to minimize his role or create comfortable fiction to protect anyone's feelings. He was choosing transparency over reputation management. "What about at your work?" Sarah asked. "Won't this affect your professional relationships?" "Possibly," David admitted, "but that's my problem to manage, not yours. I made adult choices, and I'm prepared to deal with adult consequences." The contrast between David's approach and Sarah's was stark. She wanted to manage the truth, control the narrative, and minimize the social fallout from her affair. He was prepared to accept whatever consequences came from being honest about what had happened. I found myself respecting his integrity, even while resenting his very existence in our lives. We spent the next 2 hours discussing logistics that felt surreal in their ordinariness. Hospital visits during delivery, how the birth certificate should be handled, what last name the baby would carry, how holidays and birthdays would be divided between households. We were planning the practical details of raising a child together while carefully avoiding the emotional reality of what we were actually doing. Sarah said very little during these discussions, answering direct questions but contributing nothing to the planning process. I could see her withdrawing into herself, overwhelmed by the complex future we were constructing around her pregnancy. This wasn't the family she'd envisioned when she'd excitedly shared her positive test with me just 2 weeks earlier. When David finally left, Sarah and I sat in our living room surrounded by the lingering tension of his presence. The comfortable space where we'd once relaxed together now felt contaminated by the reality of our new circumstances. Every decision we made about this pregnancy would involve a third person who had intimate knowledge of my wife and legal rights to the child she was carrying. "This isn't what I wanted," Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between us since David's departure. "What did you want?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I wanted us to be a family, just us. I wanted to raise this baby together and pretend that Denver never happened." Her fantasy had always been built on lies and willful ignorance. She'd wanted the excitement of an affair without the consequences, the joy of motherhood without the complications of paternity, the security of marriage without the responsibilities of fidelity. But life doesn't offer those kinds of convenient compartments, and her choices had created a reality far more complex than she'd ever imagined. "That was never going to be possible," I said gently. "Even if I had agreed to your plan, the truth would have come out eventually. DNA tests are routine now. The baby might have looked like David, or acted like him, or inherited characteristics that were obviously not from our families. You can't build a life on that kind of deception. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know that now. I just wanted so desperately to fix what I'd broken, to make everything go back to the way it was before. But there is no going back from betrayal of this magnitude. The life we'd built together over 15 years had been fundamentally altered by her 3-week affair. We could try to build something new from the wreckage, but it would never be the same innocent partnership we'd once shared. Too much trust had been destroyed, too many assumptions proven false. Over the following weeks, Sarah's pregnancy progressed while we navigated the increasingly complex logistics of our unusual situation. David called regularly to check on her health and the baby's development. He sent flowers after each doctor's appointment and researched pregnancy nutrition with the dedication of someone making up for lost time. His attentiveness was both touching and infuriating, a constant reminder of his growing involvement in what should have been an intimate experience between my wife and me. Sarah seemed to grow more depressed with each passing day. The excitement she'd initially felt about the pregnancy was overshadowed by the complicated reality of co-parenting with two men who had very different relationships with her. She'd lost control of her own narrative, and she struggled to find her place in the family structure we were creating. Meanwhile, I wrestled with my own conflicted emotions about the situation. Part of me wanted to walk away from the entire mess, to file for divorce, and let Sarah and David figure out their parenting arrangement without me. But another part of me felt oddly protective of this unborn child who would be born into such complicated circumstances. They hadn't asked for any of this chaos, and they deserved at least one stable adult figure in their life. The turning point came during Sarah's second trimester ultrasound. We'd agreed that David should be present for major medical appointments, so all three of us crowded into the small examination room to see the baby for the first time. When the technician found the heartbeat and the tiny form appeared on the monitor, the room fell completely silent. Watching that ultrasound, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't an abstract problem anymore or a symbol of Sarah's betrayal. This was a tiny human being growing inside my wife, completely innocent of the complicated circumstances that had led to their conception. They deserved to be loved and protected regardless of who their biological father was or how their parents had managed to create such a mess of their personal lives. Sarah was crying as she watched the screen, her hand instinctively reaching for mine. David sat on the other side of the room, his face a mixture of awe and uncertainty. None of us had expected to be in this situation, but here we were, three adults preparing to raise a child together in the most unconventional arrangement imaginable. "The baby looks healthy," the technician said cheerfully, oblivious to the complex emotions swirling in the room. "Everything appears to be developing normally. Would you like to know the sex?" Sarah looked at me, then at David, uncertainty clear in her expression. This was another decision that required negotiation between three people who had very different relationships with this pregnancy. "Yes," David said quietly. "I'd like to know." Sarah nodded her agreement, and I found myself curious despite everything. "It's a girl," the technician announced, pointing to specific features on the ultrasound image. "A healthy baby girl. A daughter." Sarah and I had often talked about what we'd name our children if we ever got pregnant, but those conversations had always been hypothetical. Now we had a real baby to consider, a little girl who would need a name that three adults could agree on, who would grow up knowing she had a complicated family structure that most of her peers wouldn't understand. After the appointment, we sat in my car in the hospital parking lot, none of us quite ready to return to our separate lives. The ultrasound had made everything more real, more immediate. We were no longer dealing with abstract concepts of custody and co-parenting. We were planning for an actual baby girl who would arrive in just a few months. "I want her to know all of us," David said finally. "I don't want her to grow up confused about who her parents are or why her family looks different from other families. She should know that she was loved by everyone involved in bringing her into the world." It was a beautiful sentiment, but I wondered how realistic it would be to maintain that kind of loving cooperation over the years. Children ask difficult questions, and teenagers can be particularly cruel about family situations that don't fit conventional models. Our daughter would need more than good intentions to navigate the social complications of her unusual parentage. "We should think about counseling," I suggested. "Family therapy to help us work through how we're going to handle this long term. This baby deserves parents who can communicate effectively and put her needs ahead of their own discomfort." Both Sarah and David agreed, and we scheduled our first session with a family therapist who specialized in non-traditional family structures. Patricia Reeves had worked with divorced blended families and other complex arrangements, but even she admitted that our situation was unique in her experience. The therapy sessions were awkward at first, filled with long silences and carefully worded responses. Sarah struggled to articulate her feelings about the situation, alternating between guilt about her affair and resentment about the consequences. David maintained his commitment to honesty and responsibility, but clearly felt uncomfortable discussing intimate details in front of me. I found myself playing mediator, trying to keep our discussions focused on the baby's needs rather than our personal grievances. Gradually, we began to develop a framework for co-parenting that acknowledged our complex dynamics while prioritizing our daughter's well-being. We agreed on shared decision-making for major issues like education and healthcare, alternating weekend visits, and holiday arrangements that would allow her to develop relationships with both sides of her biological family. More importantly, we began to discuss how we would explain her unusual family structure as she grew up. We decided on age-appropriate honesty, telling her from the beginning that she had a daddy who lived with mommy, and another daddy who lived separately, but loved her just as much. We would avoid euphemisms or complicated explanations that might confuse her, instead normalizing her family arrangement so she could explain it confidently to others. As Sarah's pregnancy advanced, our unusual arrangement began to settle into a routine of sorts. David attended every important appointment, contributed to baby gear, purchases, and even helped assemble the crib that would go in what we'd started calling Sarah's room instead of our room. I'd moved permanently into the guest bedroom, unable to share intimate space with Sarah while processing the ongoing complications of her affair. Our families struggled to understand and accept the situation. My parents were supportive but confused, unable to comprehend why I was staying involved in raising another man's child. Sarah's family was mortified by the public nature of her infidelity and the unconventional solution we'd chosen. David's parents were surprisingly gracious, expressing gratitude that their son was taking responsibility for his actions even while disapproving of the circumstances that had led to this point. The hardest part was watching Sarah navigate her own conflicted emotions about the pregnancy. She'd wanted motherhood for so long, but not under these circumstances. She'd wanted to share this experience with me, but not with David's constant involvement. She'd wanted to start a family, but not one that required negotiating every decision with her former lover and her betrayed husband. Some days she seemed almost manic with preparation, ordering baby clothes and researching parenting techniques with desperate enthusiasm. Other days she was withdrawn and depressed, unable to engage with the reality of her situation. I found myself worrying more about her mental health than about the practical logistics of co-parenting, concerned that the stress of our arrangement was affecting both her and the baby. Dr. Reeves helped us recognize that Sarah was grieving the loss of the family she'd imagined while trying to embrace the family she was actually creating. Her affair had destroyed not just our marriage but her own vision of motherhood. She was going to be a single mother in many ways, sharing custody with two men who would never be able to give her the unified family experience she'd always wanted. As we entered the third trimester, the reality of our daughter's impending arrival became impossible to ignore. We needed to finalize birth plans, complete legal paperwork, and prepare for the practical aspects of bringing a baby home to this complicated arrangement. David wanted to be present for the delivery. Sarah was ambivalent about having him there during such an intimate moment, and I wasn't sure I could handle watching another man's child being born to my wife. We compromised on David being present at the hospital but not in the delivery room during the actual birth. He would wait outside and meet his daughter immediately after she was born, giving Sarah and me a few private moments with her before beginning the complex process of shared custody from day one. The legal arrangements were even more complicated. David would be listed as the biological father on the birth certificate, but I would need to formally adopt the baby if I wanted legal parental rights. This meant court appearances, background checks, and official documentation of our unusual family structure. Our daughter would legally have 3 parents, something that required careful navigation of state laws that hadn't been written with situations like ours in mind. We decided to name her Emma Claire, committing David's surname with Sarah's maiden name to reflect her dual heritage, while avoiding any association with me until the adoption process was complete. It felt strange to choose a name for a child I was planning to raise, but who wouldn't legally be mine, for several more months. another reminder of how complicated we'd made something that should have been simple and joyful. The weeks leading up to Emma's birth were filled with preparations that felt both exciting and surreal. We installed car seats in 2 different vehicles, created duplicate sets of baby supplies for David's apartment and our house, and practiced diaper-changing techniques with a doll that would need to survive multiple households. We were preparing to be parents together while living separate lives, an arrangement that required constant coordination and communication. Sarah went into labor on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was at work. David was in Seattle for meetings that week, a coincidence that felt like either fate or karma, depending on your perspective. I rushed to the hospital to find Sarah already in active labor, David pacing nervously in the waiting room, and nurses trying to understand our unconventional family arrangement. The delivery was long and difficult, with complications that required medical intervention in extended months. I held Sarah's hand through contractions, coached her breathing during the worst moments, and tried to focus on supporting her, rather than dwelling on the fact that we were about to welcome another man's child into the world. For those hours in the delivery room, we were just a married couple experiencing the miracle of birth together. Emma Claire Chen Martinez entered the world at 3:47 a.m. on Wednesday morning, screaming with the indignant fury of someone who hadn't expected to be evicted from her comfortable womb. She was tiny and perfect, with David's dark hair, and Sarah's delicate features, a beautiful combination of her biological parents that made her parentage undeniably clear. Sarah wept when the doctor placed Emma on her chest, overwhelmed by emotions that had been building for months. I felt my own tears starting as I looked at this tiny person who was somehow both the symbol of my wife's betrayal and an innocent child deserving of love and protection. In that moment, all the complicated logistics of custody and co-parenting faded into background noise behind the simple reality of new life. David met his daughter 10 minutes later, when the medical team had finished their initial assessments, and Sarah felt ready to share this moment with him. Watching him hold Emma for the first time was heartbreaking and beautiful simultaneously. His face filled with wonder and terror, the expression of a man realizing that his life had just changed forever in ways he couldn't possibly comprehend. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "She's absolutely perfect." Emma was perfect, despite the complicated circumstances of her conception and the unusual family structure she was inheriting. She was also going to need 3 adults who could put aside their personal issues to provide her with stability, love, and consistent care. Looking at her tiny face, I made a commitment that had nothing to do with legal documents or custody arrangements, and everything to do with the responsibility I felt toward this innocent child. The first few weeks of Emma's life were exhausting for everyone involved. Sarah struggled with postpartum recovery while trying to establish breastfeeding and adjust to motherhood. David visited daily, learning how to change diapers and soothe a crying baby while navigating the awkwardness of being in our home. I tried to be supportive of Sarah while bonding with a child who looked increasingly like her biological father with each passing day. Sleep deprivation made everything more difficult. Simple decisions about feeding schedules or diaper brands required negotiations between 3 adults who were all learning how to be parents while managing their own complex emotions about the situation. Emma didn't care about our personal drama, she just needed consistent care and attention, which meant we had to function as a team regardless of our individual feelings about each other. The arrangement that had seemed workable in theory proved much more challenging in practice. David's apartment wasn't set up for overnight visits with an infant, so Emma stayed with Sarah and me during the week while he visited for several hours each day. Weekends became complicated negotiations about timing and logistics, with Emma's needs taking precedence over everyone's preferences. Our families tried to be supportive, but the situation was difficult for them to navigate as well. My parents wanted to bond with Emma, but struggled with the knowledge that she wasn't biologically their grandchild. Sarah's parents were embarrassed by the public nature of the situation and uncomfortable around David. David's parents were grateful to be involved but clearly overwhelmed by the complexity of the arrangement. Social situations became minefields of explanation and awkwardness. When people asked about Emma's father, we had to decide which version of the truth to share depending on the audience and the circumstances. Close friends knew the full story, casual acquaintances got abbreviated explanations, and strangers sometimes received complete fiction to avoid lengthy conversations about our unconventional family structure. Emma herself seemed remarkably adaptable to the chaos surrounding her birth. She was a generally happy baby who slept well and ate regularly, providing small mercies in a situation that was otherwise extremely challenging for all the adults involved. Watching her develop her own personality over those early weeks, I found myself falling in love with her despite the complicated circumstances of her arrival. The legal adoption process moved slowly through the court system, requiring multiple hearings, background checks, and evaluations of our unconventional family arrangement. The judge assigned to our case had never dealt with a situation where a married couple wanted to adopt a child born to the wife and her lover, with all parties consenting to the arrangement and committed to co-parenting together. Reeves provided testimony about our family therapy sessions and our commitment to putting Emma's needs first. She described our communication patterns, conflict resolution skills, and shared dedication to creating a stable environment for our daughter, despite the unusual circumstances of her birth. Her professional opinion was that Emma would benefit from having 3 committed parents rather than being denied relationships with any of the adults who wanted to be involved in her life. The adoption was finalized when Emma was 3 months old, giving me full legal parental rights and responsibilities. The ceremony was small and emotional, with Sarah, David, and I officially becoming Emma's 3 legal parents in the eyes of the law. We celebrated afterward with a quiet dinner at home, sharing Chinese takeout while Emma slept peacefully in her crib, oblivious to the legal milestone we'd just achieved. With the legal issues resolved, we were able to focus more fully on the practical aspects of raising Emma together. We developed routines that worked for everyone, established clear boundaries about household rules and discipline, and created systems for communication that minimized conflict and confusion. It wasn't easy, but it was functional, and Emma seemed to thrive in the environment we'd created for her. As Emma grew from infant to toddler, our unusual family structure became more normal for all of us. She called David Papa and me Daddy, understanding from the beginning that she had 2 fathers who loved her in different ways. She spent weeknights with Sarah and me, weekends with David, and holidays rotating between our families in carefully negotiated arrangements that ensured she maintained relationships with all of her extended family members. The 3 of us continued therapy to work through ongoing challenges and communication issues. Sarah and I slowly rebuilt some trust in our marriage, though our relationship remained fundamentally changed by her affair. David became not quite a friend, but a respectful co-parent who prioritized Emma's well-being over his own comfort or convenience. We weren't a conventional family by any measure, but we were functional, and Emma was clearly loved and well cared for. Looking back on those early months of Emma's life, I'm amazed that we managed to make it work at all. The combination of sleep deprivation, emotional trauma, legal complications, and social awkwardness could have destroyed all of our relationships and created an unstable environment for Emma. Instead, we somehow found ways to put our personal issues aside long enough to provide her with the consistency and care she needed. 5 years have passed since Emma entered our lives, and I can honestly say that our unconventional family has found its rhythm. Emma is now a bright, curious kindergartner who switches effortlessly between calling me Daddy and David Papa without any confusion about who plays what role in her life. She's never known any other family structure, so to her having 3 parents feels completely normal. Sarah and I rebuilt our marriage slowly, with many setbacks and difficult conversations along the way. We attended couples therapy for over 2 years, working through the deep wounds of her betrayal while learning to function as partners in this complex parenting arrangement. Trust didn't return overnight, but gradually, we found ways to reconnect as husband and wife rather than just co-parents managing a crisis. The turning point came during Emma's 2nd birthday party. Watching Sarah laugh as Emma blew out her candles, seeing David teaching her how to properly hold a baseball bat, and feeling my own genuine joy at this little girl's happiness, I realized we'd created something beautiful from the wreckage of our marriage. Not the family we'd originally planned, but a family nonetheless. David proved to be an exceptional father, despite his initial inexperience with children. He reads to Emma every night during his custody weekends, takes her on adventures to museums and parks, and has become one of the most devoted parents I've ever witnessed. His relationship with Emma is pure and uncomplicated in ways that sometimes make me envious, free from the baggage that Sarah and I carry from her affair. The most surprising development has been the friendship that gradually emerged between David and me. It started with practical communications about Emma's schedule and needs, but over time we discovered we actually enjoyed each other's company. We share similar interests in hiking and craft beer, and we found that we make good parenting partners, despite the unusual circumstances that brought us together. We even started a tradition of taking Emma on camping trips together, just the 3 of us. Those weekends in the mountains have become some of my favorite times, watching Emma explore nature with both of her fathers guiding her adventures. She collects rocks and tells elaborate stories around the campfire, while David and I teach her essential outdoor skills like setting up a tent and identifying bird calls. Our families eventually adjusted to the arrangement, though it took years of patience and explanation. My parents adore Emma and no longer distinguish between biological and adoptive relationships when introducing her to others. Sarah's parents remain somewhat uncomfortable with David's presence at family gatherings, but they've learned to be civil for Emma's sake. David's parents have become wonderful grandparents who send birthday cards and Christmas presents with the dedication of people making up for lost time. The community response was initially challenging but ultimately supportive. Emma's school required detailed explanations of our custody arrangement and emergency contacts, but her teachers quickly adapted to having 3 parents at school events. Other parents were curious at first, but Emma's happiness and well-adjustment spoke louder than gossip about our unconventional situation. Emma herself handles questions about her family structure with remarkable confidence for a 5-year-old. When classmates ask why she has 2 daddies, she simply explains that some families look different from others, and that she's lucky to have lots of people who love her. Her matter-of-fact acceptance of her situation has actually educated other children about family diversity in ways that formal curriculum never could. The legal aspects of our arrangement continue to evolve as Emma grows older. We've created detailed custody agreements that account for school schedules, holidays, and summer vacations. David pays child support that helps with Emma's expenses, but more importantly, he's actively involved in every major decision about her upbringing, from choosing her pediatrician to selecting her elementary school. We've also established college funds and inheritance plans that reflect Emma's unique family structure. All 3 of us contribute financially to her future education, and we've worked with attorneys to ensure that her inheritance rights are protected regardless of what happens to our individual relationships. Emma will never want for financial security, having 3 parents invested in her success. Sarah has flourished as a mother in ways that sometimes surprise me. The guilt and depression that marked Emma's early months gradually gave way to confidence and joy in parenting. She's discovered a maternal instinct that was always there but had been buried under years of fertility struggles and the trauma of her affair. Watching her with Emma, I see glimpses of the woman I fell in love with all those years ago. Our marriage isn't the same as it was before Denver, and it never will be. We've lost a certain innocence and taken for granted trust that can't be recovered, but we've built something new in its place, a partnership based on hard-won understanding rather than naive assumptions. We know each other's capacity for both betrayal and forgiveness now, and somehow that knowledge has made us stronger. The most unexpected gift of this entire experience has been learning that love is more complicated and more resilient than I ever imagined. I love Emma completely, despite knowing she isn't biologically mine. I love Sarah differently now, with full knowledge of her flaws and her capacity for mistakes. And I've developed genuine affection for David, the man whose actions once nearly destroyed my marriage but who has become an essential part of my family. Emma is thriving in kindergarten, making friends easily, and excelling in reading and mathematics. She's inherited Sarah's artistic sensibilities and David's analytical mind, along with personality traits that seem entirely her own. She's confident, empathetic, and remarkably mature for her age, qualities that I believe come from having multiple adults invested in her emotional development. Last month, Emma asked me why some of her friends seemed sad when their parents fought, since fighting was something adults sometimes needed to do to solve problems. Her question revealed the emotional intelligence she's developed from watching Sarah, David, and me navigate disagreements with respect and cooperation. She's learning conflict resolution skills from birth that many adults never master. The hardest moments still come unexpectedly, usually triggered by simple family interactions that remind me of the complicated origins of our happiness. When Emma runs to David with a scraped knee because he gives the best band-aid hugs, I feel a brief stab of loss for the simpler fatherhood I'd once imagined. But then I see her comfort and security, and I remember that her well-being matters more than my ego. David and I have had honest conversations about how our friendship affects Sarah, who sometimes feels like an outsider to the bond we've developed through co-parenting. We've learned to be mindful of including her in decisions and discussions, recognizing that she carries unique guilt about creating this situation in the first place. The 3-way dynamic requires constant attention and adjustment to keep everyone feeling valued and heard. Our success story doesn't erase the pain that brought us here, or suggest that affairs can lead to positive outcomes. The betrayal Sarah committed was devastating and unnecessary, and the healing process was long and difficult for everyone involved. But once the damage was done, we had choices about how to respond, and we chose cooperation over conflict, honesty over deception, and Emma's needs over our own comfort. Looking toward the future, I know we'll face new challenges as Emma grows older and begins asking more complex questions about her origins. Adolescence will bring identity issues that might be complicated by her unusual family structure. Dating and relationships might be affected by her understanding of love and fidelity shaped by our example, but we'll face these challenges together, as we've learned to do. I often wonder what advice I'd give to another man facing similar circumstances. Every situation is unique, and not every betrayal can be transformed into functional co-parenting. But I'd tell him that children are remarkably resilient when surrounded by adults who prioritize their well-being over personal grievances. Love isn't diminished by being shared among multiple people, it's multiplied. Emma will grow up knowing that families come in many forms, that mistakes can be survived and forgiven, and that love is a choice made daily rather than a feeling that simply happens to people. These are valuable lessons that she might not have learned in a conventional family structure, silver linings to the cloud of our complicated beginning. Our story isn't a fairy tale with a perfect ending. It's a real-life example of people making the best choices they could in an impossible situation. We're not heroes or villains, just flawed humans who discovered that families can be built on foundations other than traditional marriage and biological parentage. Love, commitment, and shared responsibility turned out to be stronger building materials than we'd ever imagined. Emma calls our arrangement her big family, and she's right. We are bigger than most families, more complex and more resilient. We've proven that betrayal doesn't have to define a family's future, that children can thrive with multiple loving parents, and that forgiveness can coexist with accountability. Most importantly, we've learned that the best families aren't perfect, they're simply committed to growing and healing together, one day at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.